Hello, AP Scholars. We are taking a look at our free response question practice number 4, FRQ practice number 4. This was taken from the 2014 AP exam, and it's about strings and a list of strings in the second part. And the idea is that you're scrambling a string. So if you remember our string stuff, this is a string builder question. We're basically going to loop through a string and return a different string based on some rules. Those rules are summarized here, but basically we're going to be swapping around in the position of the letter A, if we find a letter A inside of our string. In our new string that we're going to create and return, note that we're not modifying the existing string, we're just creating a new one. We're going to swap the A with the next character. As long as it's not an A. If there's two A's in a row, we don't touch it. But if there's an A followed by another letter that's not A, then we swap them. Note that the A at the end doesn't get swapped because there's nothing after it. Double A's, the thing with the double A's is nothing. Like, this A doesn't get swapped. This A does get swapped. That's why we get our A after here. But this A, nothing really happens. I mean, I guess you could swap it with an A. Nothing would change. So there you go. That's a fair way. You don't have to really worry about it too much. So there it is. If it has no A's, nothing really changes at all. So those are the rules of how the question works. So here's my answer to the question. Again, it takes that parameter, that's the word, and we're going to return a scrambled version of it. So this is a string builder question. I keep track of where we are in this word as we loop through it. And here's my initial declaration of this result variable that I will be returning as a string. And it is starting at nothing, so we're going to add to it as we build it. So this is my while loop. I decided to use a while loop because I sometimes will increase the index by 2 and sometimes I'll increase it by 1. I mean, you could use the for loop and, monkeyed around with that a little bit. It would be fine. I think the while loop for me just lets me be a little bit more flexible, but, you could do this with a for loop as well. So here's what I do. I check to see if I have an A. And the next, so at current, my index, I check to see if that using substring is an A in the string of word. And I check to see the next one is not an A. And if that's true, then what I do is I add the second letter that's not an A, and then an A after it. And then I increment by 2, because I have to skip over those 2 because I've already scrambled them. If this was not true, in other words, I didn't find an A, or I found an A and the next one was an A as well, then I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to add that letter, the current letter, to the new string and increment by 1. So that's the story there. You could end up, though, by the end of it, because you're going up by 2, that could be a bit of a problem because you could end up in a situation where you're left with one letter. And here's another reason why the while loop is great, because I declare that int outside of the loop. You could do that with a for loop too, I suppose, but you have to do it in a while loop. So then I can check to see, did I get to the end? And if I'm not at the end yet, I can just dump whatever's left over. I might have a single letter left or something. So then I can return the result, and that should build the string according to the rules that were asserted in the question. So that's question 1A. Question 1B is down here. Basically, in the same class as the previous question, the method, I guess, is in. We have ourselves a word list, and what we want to do is make a method called scramble or remove. And the idea is that it parses through our list, so it goes from thing to thing, and it checks to see if there's anything in this list that is, well, first it checks to see if something can be scrambled, and if it is, it replaces the item in that list with the scrambled version. It also checks for things that cannot be scrambled. So in other words, like whoa and eggs do not scramble, they are the same. So if they are not scrambleable, oh, that's funny, I get it now, eggs and scrambled eggs. Ooh, that's a bad joke, AP exam. Anyways, they are scramblable, so we remove them from the list. So it's 2 jobs. We either scramble or we remove, depending on whether or not they change after scrambling. That's it. That's the story. It's got a confusing question, the way it's worded. Um, and I think it's really important to note that we should, like this list needs to be maintained. So like how do you replace something in a list is a pretty good question. So we'll see how to do that. So here's my answer. And I am, again, taking in the word list. Oh yeah, it's not an instance variable, it's a parameter, so that's important to know. And we are going to be returning this same, oh sorry, it's a void, it's void, oh yeah. So we're not returning anything. So it has to modify this list. It actually will go through this list and change the actual list. It's not building a new list, it's modifying this list. That's an important thing to note from the question. We did some of this back in the data structures unit when we looked at lists in January. We had examples of these questions where sometimes they ask you to modify the list, sometimes they ask you to return a new list. So this is the type where you modify the list. So we're just going to start at 0. I'm using a while loop again. For funsies, I guess it's super important. You could do it, I guess, different ways. And I'm just doing it until I get to the end of the list. And the idea here is I get a word out of the word list, and then I'm going to scramble it. So I'm going to scramble that word using the scramble word method that we wrote in part 1. And I'm going to store that as a separate string. And note that because strings are immutable, this doesn't actually change the word. Also, this method doesn't change it anyways, so we haven't broken the list in any way. So the list is still the same after doing that. And then what I can do is check to see if they're the same. If they're the same, if the word is the same as the scrambled version, well, that means I gotta remove it. So I just chuck it. And then I guess the opposite is possible. If I did in fact scramble it, then I'm going, if they were not the same afterwards, then I will use set to replace it. And then I have to go up by 1. This is important for lists to remember that if you remove something from the list, you don't have to increment forward. There's a number of ways to solve this problem. You could also have looped backwards through this list and done it and not have to worry about that. But remember, array lists have that pitfall of when you're removing things from a list, you have to make sure you don't also increment, unless you're going backwards, because you'll skip things. So that's the answer for question 1b. Hope that makes sense, and feel free to ask more questions about these in the discussion channel or email me or anything you like. Okay, thanks everybody.